Okay, so today we are picking up with a new kind of warfare and how that is going to make World War I very different from any previous wars that had been fought. The style of how this war is fought is very different. Previous wars had been fought in the Napoleonic style, and Napoleonic style is where you had professional soldiers who were in the military for life. They were used to fighting face to face and seeing their enemy. And you had standard units. You had a cavalry unit and you had an infantry unit, and you would volley back and forth. That one side would shoot and then the next side would shoot and then the other side would shoot and the next side would shoot. So back and forth, just like volleyball game kind of thing. The Civil War is very emblematic of Napoleonic warfare, that you could see and face your enemy, and then one line would shoot their rifles, and then the other side would shoot, and then you'd see how many were left. And then one side would shoot, and the other side would shoot, and then you'd see how many were left. How many did you kill? So that would be very typical of the Civil War. However, remember, by this time, we have had the Industrial Revolution. And the Industrial Revolution is going to change warfare forever. In the industrialized war of World War I, or the Great War, you had drafted citizens. So people who were not really even that familiar with the military could be fighting. You had trench warfare, where you didn't always see your enemy. They were hidden from you. And you had an industrialized units. You had artillery. You still had infantry, but you had navy, and we begin to see the beginnings of aircraft. And so World War I is very typical of your industrialized warfare. And the only way that you win really is through sabotage and mass assaults. And so eventually what happens is we get this creation of massive amounts of bodies. The only way to win is to take land, and the only way to take land is to massively assault the other side, and thousands of men are going to die for just a few yards advance. A great example would be the Battle of the Somme. In the Battle of the Somme, 1.2 million men will die just to gain 7 miles of land. Not a lot. Not enough to make a difference, definitely. But 1.2 million dead in this one battle. Eventually what we'll see with this trench warfare, and we're going to talk more about the trenches, but there's going to be this no man's land. And no man's land was the land between the opposing trench lines. That was filled with craters and unused shells and barbed wire. And like I said, industrialized warfare is going to lead us to trench warfare. Now, trench warfare for the most part takes place on the Western Front. And the Western Front is different from the Eastern Front. The Western Front is going to be fought between France and Great Britain and Germany. So Germany versus France and Great Britain. That's the Western Front. But remember, the Germans also had declared war on Russia. So the Eastern Front was Germany against Russia. So Germany actually had split forces, and they had to fight on two fronts. Puts them at a disadvantage. So on the Western Front is where we're going to see a lot of the trench warfare. On the Eastern Front, Russia has their own issues, and that's going to prevent trench warfare from developing. So let's look at a couple diagrams of the trenches. The trenches were somewhere between 1 to 2 feet wide. They were about 6 feet deep. And at the bottom you'd have a layer of about 6 inches of mud. So you're tromping through that all the time. What was it like in there? Well, not nice. You had to deal with rats. You had to deal with disease. You had to deal with food shortages. It was boring. I mean, there's not really much to do. If you stuck your head up, you're going to get schmucked by a sniper. You had to face attacks at dawn. Attacks at dawn were to whose advantage? It was to the Germans' advantage to attack at dawn, because the sun would be behind them, and that would blind the Allies. So they wouldn't typically attack at dusk because we don't have night vision goggles yet. It's not part of this technology at the time. And so that's going to inhibit us attacking them with the sun behind us. So the Eastern Front, what was it like on the Eastern Front? Well, Russia, remember, helps the Serbians. They are willing to take on the fight. In fact, the Russian army was known as the steamroller. You know, the big metal round things that roll over a road to tamp down dirt and that kind of stuff. The reason the Russian army is known as the steamroller is because it's the largest army the world had ever known up to this point. The Russians could call upon 15 million men to serve in their military. That is a large chunk of guys fighting. So they're called the steamroller because they could just roll right over anybody who opposed them. Now, the tactics that are fought on the Eastern Front, it's not trench warfare. In fact, they often fight the Napoleonic style for the most part, and a lot of that has to do with the Russian military. Yes, it's the largest, but it's not the best. Who's the best? Germany. So, in terms of weapons, Germany far outstrips Russia. They just have better stuff. They have more stuff and they have better stuff. And that's going to become pretty important in war. For Russia, they were just deficient in everything. They were deficient in artillery, in airplanes, in trucks, in cars. They didn't have enough shells for the big guns that they did have for the artillery. They didn't have enough shells to fire. Their soldiers were armed with outdated rifles. Only half the men were adequately armed. They were very poorly trained. Most of them were illiterate, so when written orders came to go move your troops to this location, they couldn't read them. There was no radio or telephone communications. They just didn't have that infrastructure in Russia. There's no railroad system. And they did have a cavalry. The Cossack cavalry was very feared. In fact, in previous wars, men had just surrendered when they knew the Cossacks were coming. But what good are men on horses with swords against machine guns? Not very. So when you look at the movements of the Russian army, they do make their move against Eastern Germany. That's who they're willing to take on the fight to. But a classic example is the battle at Königsberg. And Königsberg is this fortress city, and it's located on a lake. And they needed to take this city because it was part of a major transportation route. So what the Russians decide to do, Königsberg is under the control of the Germans, and the Russians want to take it over. So what the Russians decide to do is that they're going to split their forces. So they have a northern force and a southern force, and they're going to surround the city and take the fortress city because they're going to surround it, and nobody can get out and nobody can get in. Unfortunately for the Russian military, the leaders, the commanders of the Northern Division and the Southern Division hate each other. They are bitter enemies, and they refuse to speak to each other or even to communicate when they're in the field. And so the German commander of Königsberg, he knew that they were out there, and he was told to hold off the Russian army until reinforcements could arrive. And so that's what he does. He just sits back and waits. And so what happens is that the leader of the Northern Division thought, well, I'm going to go in and take over the city for myself, and I'm going to get all the glory, and the other guy, he's not even going to be a part of it. And so he goes in, and he gets destroyed by the Germans. The guy in the south has no clue this is happening, but basically figures, fine, he doesn't want to talk to me, I'm going to go take it over and take all the glory for myself. And he goes in, and he gets destroyed by the Germans. So if they had just communicated with each other, could have been a whole different ending to the story. But as is, the Germans soundly defeat the Russians because communications sucked, and the Germans had the railroad infrastructure to bring more troops and reinforcements quickly, and the Russians did not. So the Russians are going to retreat back to Russia, and they begin digging in. They begin doing a little bit of trench warfare. But then they decide, well, let's not take on Germany. Germany might be a little too tough for us. So let's go test our soldiers against Austria-Hungary. So they have better luck against Austria-Hungary, not because they're any better at doing their military stuff, purely because they have more numbers. But Austria-Hungary is going to be saved by German reinforcements because Austria-Hungary is getting pounded on. And so they're going to say, oh, Germany, we need your help. And Germany sends reinforcements. It's at this point that Germany realizes that its allies kind of suck. It's great to have them, but it sucks that you always have to go save them. So the Germans realize that they will have to win the war on their own if they're going to win this. Luckily for the Germans, not so much anybody else, but luckily for the Germans, the Russian Revolution will take place in 1917. So about 3 years into the war. Vladimir Lenin decides that we have problems at home. We need to focus on those. And so he's going to make a separate treaty with Germany. And in this separate treaty, he's going to give up a heck of a lot of territory to Germany just so he can get out of this war. But what this is going to do is it's going to make the war a one-front war. Obviously, Great Britain and France are not going to be happy with Russia because they were in the Triple Entente together. They're supposed to stick together and help each other out. And here's Russia bailing on them. They didn't like that. They're going to remember this. They did not like that. So now Germany can focus all of its attention against France and Great Britain. And it comes to a deadlock. Nobody is gaining an advantage. Nobody is winning. And that's everywhere. That's on the Western Front. That's on the Italian front. That's on the African front. Everywhere that there is fighting taking place, nobody is winning. They're basically at a deadlock. And so when you compare the military forces at this time in 1914, Austria-Hungary had about 2 million guys. Germany had about 5.2 million guys that they could call up. France, 4 million. Russia, remember, 15 million that they could call up, but they were only using 5.5. Serbia, 240,000. Great Britain, 731,000. They're fairly even numbers. Nobody's winning. There's no clear advantage. And when Russia drops out, that takes a whole chunk of them away. And so, again, very, very close numbers on that. Well, at this point, somebody's looking, both sides are looking for anybody to come in to tip the balance. And they're looking at it at the U.S. Well, the U.S. at the very beginning said, nope, we're neutral. We want no part of this. That's across the ocean. It's across the pond. We want nothing to do with it. It's not our issue. The war did not threaten American lives. It didn't threaten American property. So it was not a national concern for us. However, there are some people who didn't like that we were neutral, and there were some who supported that we were neutral. Those that were opposed to it said, we can't be neutral. We have a lot of close ties to England. We share an ancestry, we share language, we share literature, a legal system with them. We need to help them out. The Germans have been so aggressive. Look what they did to poor neutral Belgium. And we had heard a lot of propaganda stories of how they had gone in and shot women and children for resisting, and that they had destroyed public buildings and all kinds of stuff. And so there was a lot of people that were saying, no, we can't be neutral. We can't be neutral in the face of this. We have to defend people who have been wrongly killed. And then you will have those that say, yes, we need to be neutral. We need to stay out of it. We need to set an example of peace. Those Europeans, they don't know how to be peaceful. We have to show them. We can't be out gallivanting and fighting and that kind of stuff. Let's show them how to be peaceful. We can stay out of this war. Others did not want their sons to experience war, that they had experienced war themselves, and they did not want their sons to experience that life. And others still will say, we're isolationist. We worry about ourselves. This war that's happening over there, it's not our concern, not our problem. We shouldn't get involved. And so eventually it's going to come to a point where we have no choice. We need to get involved, not only to protect our allies or to protect our friends or whatever, but to protect American lives and protect American property.